Margaret Ricci counted the ceiling tiles above the kitchen table because counting was easier than crying, and she had already promised herself she would not cry, not tonight, not with Concetta standing 3 feet away watching her chew like she was grading a performance nobody had asked her to give. The dining room was 20 feet away. She could hear the clink of silver against porcelain, hear Marco's sisters laughing at something, hear the low hum of a family eating dinner together the way families were supposed to. She sat instead at the small enamel table pushed against the kitchen wall, a plate of the same food in front of her, eating alone because Concetta had decided, 3 months into this marriage, that a woman built the way Margaret was built did not belong at a table where guests could see her. "You eat slow," Concetta said, arms crossed over her apron, watching from the doorway. "That is good. Slow is good for you." Margaret did not answer. She had learned, in 3 months, that answering only gave Concetta more to work with, more silence to fill with the particular cruelty she wrapped in the language of concern. She kept her eyes on the plate and her fork moving at whatever pace felt survivable, and she told herself, the way she told herself every night this had happened, that this was temporary, that Marco did not know, that if he knew he would put a stop to it in the time it took him to say her name. She did not hear the front door. She did not hear his footsteps in the hallway, quieter than they should have been for a man his size, because Marco Ricci moved through rooms like the air owed him passage. What she heard was the sudden, total silence from the dining room, the kind of silence that meant every fork had stopped moving at once, and then his voice, low and even, asking a question that made her blood go cold before she understood a single word of it. "Where is my wife?" It was not a question the way other men asked questions. It was already an accusation, already halfway to a verdict, and Margaret's hand froze around her fork as she heard his chair. No, not his chair. Someone else's chair scrape back hard against the floor. "She's eating," Concetta said from the kitchen doorway, and Margaret watched her mother-in-law's spine straighten in a way that told her the older woman had not, until this exact second, considered that her son might come home 3 days early from Palermo and walk in through the back entrance instead of the front. "She's eating where?" Margaret set the fork down. Her hands were shaking, and she hated that they were shaking, because 3 months of quiet humiliation had at least taught her how to keep her face still even when everything underneath it was breaking. She heard him cross the dining room in 4 steps, and then he was standing in the kitchen doorway behind his mother, and Margaret looked up and saw his face for the first time in 9 days, and it was not the face of a man who was simply tired from travel. It was the face of a man doing math he did not want to finish. His eyes went from his mother to the small enamel table, to the single plate, to the chair pulled up against the wall where no guest would ever be seated, and then, finally, to Margaret's face and whatever he saw there, the redness around her eyes she had not managed to blink away in time, the way her shoulders had curled inward like she was trying to take up less space in a kitchen that had already decided she deserved less of it, made something in his expression go very still and very cold. "How long?" he said, and his voice had dropped so low that Margaret felt it more than heard it. "Has this been happening?" Nobody answered. Concetta's mouth opened and closed again, and Margaret understood, watching her, that this was the first time in Concetta's life someone had made her hesitate before speaking. "I asked a question," Marco said. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The stillness of it was worse than shouting would have been. The particular quiet Margaret had learned, in 3 months of marriage, belonged to him alone in this family. A silence that made grown men who ran territories across 3 boroughs go quiet themselves when it landed in a room. "Marco, it isn't what you think," Concetta started, and he held up one hand, just slightly, and she stopped as if the gesture had physically touched her. "I think," he said, "that I have been gone 9 days, and in 9 days my mother decided my wife does not deserve to sit at my table in my house. I think that is exactly what I think, and I would like someone to tell me I am wrong." Nobody told him he was wrong. Margaret sat very still in her chair, aware suddenly of every part of her body the way she had been aware of it every day since she married into this family. The softness at her middle that Concetta had commented on within the first week, the size of her hands, the way her dress fit differently than the dresses the other Ricci women wore. She had spent 3 months believing that if she simply endured it quietly, if she gave Concetta nothing to escalate against, this would resolve itself, that Marco's love would be enough of a shield even from a distance. She understood now, watching his face, that she had been protecting the wrong person from the wrong truth. "Get up," Marco said. And for a terrible half-second Margaret thought the words were meant for her. Thought this was somehow about to become worse before it became better. Then she saw where his eyes had gone, saw them fixed on his mother, and understood. Marco, I am an old woman. You do not speak to me that way in my own house. This is not your house. He had not moved from the doorway, but something in the way he said it made the whole kitchen feel smaller. This has not been your house since I was 26 years old, and you know that better than anyone alive. You are a guest at my table, exactly the same as everyone else who sits at it, and I have just learned that you have spent 9 days deciding my wife is not entitled to the same guest status you enjoy. Margaret's throat tightened. She had imagined this moment, in the quiet hours after Conchetta's comments had settled into her chest like stones. Imagined Marco finding out. Imagined some version of rescue. She had never imagined it would feel like this, cold and precise and entirely without mercy. A man dismantling his own mother's authority in real time because the alternative was letting the cruelty stand. She is soft, Conchetta said, and something in her voice had shifted from defensive to genuinely confused, as though she truly could not understand why this required an explanation. A wife like this reflects on you. People talk. I was protecting the family name. You were humiliating my wife in my own kitchen, Marco said, and calling it protection. There is a word for that, and it is not the word you are using. He crossed the kitchen then, past his mother, past his sisters who had gathered silently in the doorway behind her, and knelt beside Margaret's chair so that he was no longer looking down at her, so that for the first time in this entire conversation he was looking directly into her eyes at her own height. His hand came up to her face, and she flinched slightly, not from him, never from him, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of being touched gently in this room where every previous touch had been Conchetta's hand pushing a plate closer to the wall. How long? He said again, quieter now, only for her. Since the second week, Margaret admitted, and her voice cracked on it. 3 months of swallowed humiliation finally finding a way out. She said it would upset the guests. She said a woman my size at the head table was, her word was, unbecoming. I didn't want to call you while you were working. I didn't want you to think I couldn't handle your family. Something moved behind his eyes that Margaret had never seen there before, not in 3 months of marriage, not in the year of courtship before it. A kind of fury so controlled it looked almost like calm, and she understood, watching it, that she had just witnessed the version of him that other men in this city spent their whole lives trying to avoid provoking. You will never eat in this kitchen again, he said. Not because I am telling you to sit at that table. Because that table does not exist for you as a rule someone else gets to enforce. You sit wherever you want in this house, every single day, for the rest of your life, and the day someone tells you otherwise is the day I stop caring what blood they share with me. Margaret's eyes filled, and this time she did not try to stop it, because the tears were not the same tears she had been swallowing for 3 months. Conchetta made a small, sharp sound behind them, somewhere between protest and disbelief, and Marco did not turn to acknowledge it. He stayed exactly where he was, kneeling beside his wife's chair in a kitchen that had been used as a punishment room, and for the first time since she had married into this family, Margaret let herself believe that the ground beneath her had actually changed. The dinner that followed was the strangest meal of Margaret's married life. Not because of what was said, though plenty was said, but because of where she sat. Marco pulled her chair, plate and all, from the small enamel table against the wall and set it at the head of the dining table beside his own, the seat that had, for 3 months, belonged to whichever cousin or associate happened to be visiting that week. The seat Conchetta had made unmistakably clear was never meant for her. Nobody spoke while he did it. His sisters, Adriana and Beatrice, sat with their hands folded and their eyes on their plates, and Margaret understood, watching them, that this was not simply Conchetta's cruelty she had been enduring. It had been sanctioned, quietly, by every woman in this family who had chosen comfort over confrontation, and now that comfort had run out. Eat, Marco said, once her chair was settled, once her plate sat in front of her on linen instead of enamel. His hand rested briefly on her shoulder, warm and certain, before he took his own seat. You have 3 months of dinners to catch up on. Margaret picked up her fork with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and for the first time since she had married into the Ricci family, She ate at a table where her presence was not an argument someone else got to have without her. Concetta did not sit down. She stood at the head of the kitchen doorway, her face gone pale in a way that suggested she was only now understanding the scope of what she had lost. Not simply an argument about seating, but her son's willingness to let her authority in his house go unquestioned. "You would choose her over your own mother," Concetta said finally, her voice thin in a way Margaret had never heard from her. "I am not choosing between you," Marco said, without looking up from his plate. "There is no version of loyalty in this family where cruelty toward my wife earns you anything but distance from me. You built that choice yourself the day you decided she did not belong at this table. I am simply telling you the cost." The silence that followed was heavier than any silence Margaret had endured in 3 months of quiet humiliation, and she understood, watching Marco's face, calm now, deliberately calm, that this was not the end of the conversation. It was only the first cost being named, and there would be others. 3 weeks passed, and the household reorganized itself around a fact that had not existed before that night, the fact that Margaret Ricci was not a woman to be managed quietly by the family matriarch, but a woman whose husband had drawn a line so clearly that even the most stubborn corners of the family understood it could not be crossed without consequence. Concetta grew quiet in a way that felt less like acceptance and more like recalculation, and Margaret, who had spent 3 months learning to read every shift in that woman's silence, did not trust it for a single day. She was right not to trust it. It began with small things, the kind of small things that were easy to dismiss individually, and only became a pattern when Margaret started writing them down in the back pages of a notebook she kept for grocery lists. An invitation to a cousin's engagement dinner that arrived for Marco and somehow never mentioned her name. A seamstress Concetta recommended for an event dress who kept insisting, with false apology in her voice, that certain silhouettes simply were not made in Margaret's size, as though the fabric itself had opinions about her body. A comment, dropped casually at a family gathering, about how strange it was that Marco had married so quickly, so far outside what anyone had expected of him, as if Margaret herself were an anomaly requiring explanation to people who had never met her. Margaret said nothing to Marco about any of it at first. She told herself she was handling it, the same lie she had told herself about the kitchen table, and it was only when she found herself standing in front of her closet one morning, staring at a dress that had been altered without her permission to sit differently on her body, tighter through the middle in a way clearly meant to be noticed and commented on, that she understood she was making the exact mistake that had nearly cost her 3 months of dignity already. She told him that night, at dinner, at the head of the table where she now sat every evening without argument. She told him about the invitation, the seamstress, the altered dress, watching his face carefully as she spoke because she had learned that his stillness meant something was happening beneath the surface that the rest of the room could not see. "Say that again," he said when she finished, his voice gone very quiet. "The dress in my closet," Margaret said. "Someone had it taken in. Nobody asked me. I found it this morning." Marco set down his fork with a precision that felt louder than if he had thrown it across the room. "Who had access to your closet?" "Marco, I don't want this to become a war between you and your mother over a dress." "It is not about the dress," he said, and something in his voice made the temperature of the room drop several degrees. "It is about the fact that someone in my house believes they still have the right to touch what belongs to you without your permission, 3 weeks after I made it very clear that right no longer exists. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a test to see whether I meant what I said." He was right, and Margaret knew he was right, and some part of her that had spent 3 months trying to keep the peace felt a flare of fear at what came next. Not fear of Marco, never of Marco, but fear of what it would cost the family to discover exactly how far he was willing to go now that the line had been crossed a second time. She found out 2 days later, when Marco called a meeting of the family, not a dinner, not a gathering, a meeting in the study where business was normally conducted, and asked Margaret to sit beside him at the desk instead of waiting somewhere else the way wives in this family had always been expected to wait during matters that concerned the business rather than the household. Concetta arrived last, and Margaret watched her take in the room, the desk, the 2 chairs positioned side by side instead of Marco alone behind it, and something crossed her face that Margaret recognized from 3 months of careful observation, the particular expression of a woman realizing the ground had shifted further than she had accounted for. "I want to be very clear about something," Marco said, once everyone was seated. His voice carrying the same flat, calm Margaret had come to understand meant he had already decided the outcome before the conversation began. 3 weeks ago I made a decision about how my wife is treated in this house. I did not make that decision as a suggestion. I made it as a rule, and I have just learned that someone in this family believes rules made for my wife are optional in a way rules made for the business are not. Nobody spoke. The dress in her closet was altered without her knowledge or permission, he continued. I do not care who did it or why they believed it was their place to do so. What I care about is that it happened at all, which tells me the message 3 weeks ago was not received the way I intended it to be received. So I will say it again, and this time I will say it in a way that leaves no room for creative interpretation. He looked, for the first time, directly at his mother. Margaret is not a guest in this family who earns her place through your approval. She is not a project to be managed or a body to be commented on or a silhouette to be corrected without her knowledge. She is my wife, which in this house means her comfort, her dignity, and her right to exist exactly as she is carries the same weight as my own. The next person who forgets that will not simply lose access to my table. They will lose access to me. Conchetta's face had gone through several colors during the speech, settling finally on something pale and rigid that Margaret almost felt sorry for, until she remembered 3 months of small enamel plates and a kitchen wall that had felt, some nights, like the entire shape of her future. You would truly choose her over this family, Conchetta said. And this time her voice did not carry the wounded confusion of the first confrontation. It carried something closer to genuine disbelief, the sound of a woman discovering that the leverage she had spent a lifetime relying on had simply stopped working. I have already told you, Marco said. There is no choosing. There is only a rule and the people who respect it and the people who do not. You are welcome in this family exactly as long as you choose to be one of the first kind of person. That choice has always been yours. It still is. Margaret sat very still through all of it, her hand resting on the desk beside his, close enough that their fingers nearly touched, and she understood, watching the room absorb what had just been said, that something had permanently changed in the architecture of this family. Not because Marco had shouted or threatened, but because he had simply, calmly, refused to let cruelty toward her be treated as a family matter subject to negotiation. The seamstress was never mentioned again. Neither was the dress. Conchetta left the study that afternoon without another word, and for the first time in 3 months, Margaret felt something other than survival settle into her chest. It did not last as long as she hoped it would. The real danger arrived not from inside the family but from outside it, in the form of a man named Salvatore Greco, who ran the docks on the eastern side of the harbor and had spent 2 years negotiating with Marco over territory that both men wanted and neither man was willing to simply hand over. Margaret had heard his name mentioned in low voices at family dinners, had learned enough in a year of marriage to understand that Greco represented a different kind of danger than anything inside the family, a danger with guns attached to it instead of just cruel words. She learned exactly how dangerous the night Greco's men followed her car from the market 3 blocks from the house, close enough that she noticed them in her mirror before she consciously understood what she was noticing. A dark sedan matching her turns with a patience that had nothing casual about it. Margaret did not panic. She had learned, over a year in this family, that panic was a luxury nobody around her could afford, and so instead of driving home, where she would lead them directly to Marco, she drove to the busiest street she knew, pulled into the crowded lot of a restaurant where Marco's men were known to eat, and called him from inside her locked car before she ever stepped out of it. I'm being followed, she said, the moment he answered, keeping her voice steady the way she had practiced in her head 100 times without ever expecting to need it. Dork sedan. 2 men. They've been on me since the market. There was a silence on the line that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and in it Margaret heard something she had never heard from Marco before, a controlled intake of breath that told her exactly how frightened he was beneath the calm. Where are you? He said, and his voice had gone into the register she recognized now. The flat and lethal quiet that meant every soft edge of him had been set aside. The lot behind Domenico's. I'm safe. I'm not getting out of the car. Stay exactly where you are. Do not open the door for anyone but me. I am 4 minutes away. He was there in 3. Margaret watched him arrive through the windshield, watched him move through the parking lot with a stillness that made the 2 men in the sedan, who had pulled in at the far end and were clearly deciding whether to make a move, suddenly reconsider their entire evening. Marco did not run. He walked, deliberate and unhurried, and something about the calm of it was more frightening than shouting would have been. He opened her door himself, and Margaret stepped out into his arms without hesitation, feeling the tension in his body even through the fabric of his coat, the coiled readiness of a man who had spent his entire adult life prepared for exactly this kind of moment and hated, more than anything, that it had finally arrived for her. "They're gone," she said quietly, watching the sedan pull out of the lot at a speed that suggested its occupants had thought better of their assignment. "They left when they saw you. They left because I know exactly who sent them," Marco said, his jaw tight, his eyes still tracking the space where the sedan had been. "And Salvatore Greco is about to learn that sending men after my wife was the single worst decision of his career." Margaret searched his face and found, beneath the fury, something that looked almost like fear, the particular fear of a man who understood exactly how close he had just come to a version of loss he could not undo. "You're frightened," she said, and it was not a question. "I am furious," he corrected, though the correction did not entirely land. "There is a difference, Marco." She put her hand against his chest, feeling his heart beating faster than his voice let on. "Tell me the truth." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested against him. "The truth," he said finally, "is that I have buried men I called brothers in this life, and I told myself I had made peace with the cost of it. I have never once, in 17 years in this business, been afraid the way I was afraid in the 4 minutes it took me to get to you tonight. I do not know what to do with that fear. I have never had to know." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, something that had been building quietly since the night he knelt beside her chair in that kitchen, and she understood, standing in a parking lot with his heart still racing beneath her palm, that this was the moment neither of them had said out loud yet, the truth beneath everything else that had happened between them. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Whatever this costs, whatever Greco decides to do next. I am not leaving because things became dangerous. I married into this family knowing exactly what it was." "You married into a family that let my mother humiliate you for 3 months before I noticed," he said, something raw entering his voice. "You have every reason to walk away from all of it, and instead you called me from a locked car and waited for me to come. And I do not understand what I did to deserve a woman who stays through that kind of fear instead of running from it." "You didn't do anything to deserve it," Margaret said. "I decided it. That's different." He looked at her for a long moment, the parking lot lights catching something in his eyes that she had never quite seen before. Not calculation, not calm, something closer to the unguarded truth of a man who had spent his whole life being careful never to need anyone this much. "Say it again," he murmured. "I'm not leaving." He kissed her then, in the middle of a parking lot with the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes still burning through both of them, and it was nothing like the careful, measured tenderness he had shown her since the night in the kitchen. It was certain and it was desperate in a way she had never felt from him before, and Margaret understood, kissing him back, that whatever came next with Salvatore Greco, whatever cost this danger demanded, she had just made a choice that no amount of family cruelty or outside threat was going to unmake. Greco made his move 6 days later, not against Marco directly, but against the restaurant where Margaret had waited in her car, sending 2 men through the front doors during the dinner rush with a message meant for Marco but delivered, deliberately, in front of Margaret, who happened to be there that night finalizing details for a charity dinner she had been organizing with Adriana. Margaret did not freeze. She had spent 6 days since the parking lot incident thinking through exactly this scenario, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over every problem she had ever faced professionally. And when the 2 men crossed the restaurant floor toward the private room where she and Adriana were seated, she was already moving before her own fear caught up to her, sliding the folder of charity paperwork off the table and into her bag, positioning herself between the men and Adriana with a calm that surprised even her. "You're looking for my husband," Margaret said, before either man could speak, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. "He isn't here. I am. What message does Salvatore Greco want delivered?" The larger of the 2 men hesitated, clearly not having planned for the wife to speak first, to claim the room before either of them could. "Tell your husband," he said finally. That the docks belong to Greco now. Tell him the next conversation happens on Greco's terms, or it happens somewhere he cannot protect what matters to him. I heard you, Margaret said. Now get out of this restaurant before the owner calls the men currently having dinner 2 rooms over, all of whom work for my husband and all of whom would very much enjoy an excuse to finish this conversation themselves. It was a bluff, mostly, though not entirely, because she had, in fact, recognized 3 of Marco's associates seated in the main dining room when she and Adriana arrived. The men exchanged a look, weighed the risk, and left the way they had come, and it was only once the door closed behind them that Margaret's hands finally began to shake, the calm she had manufactured for the last 90 seconds draining out of her all at once. Adriana stared at her from across the table, something like awe replacing the terror that had been on her face moments before. You just negotiated with Greco's men like you do this every day. I didn't negotiate, Margaret said, sitting down hard, her legs suddenly unreliable beneath her. I bought us 30 seconds and hoped it would be enough. It was enough. Marco arrived 11 minutes later, having been called the moment the men left, and the fury on his face when he heard what happened was colder and more absolute than anything Margaret had witnessed from him before, a stillness that made the restaurant staff find sudden reasons to be elsewhere. He sent men after you in a room full of witnesses, Marco said, his voice barely above a whisper as he knelt in front of her chair, checking her face, her hands, the way she was still breathing too fast. In a restaurant where my own men were eating dinner. That is not a threat. That is a declaration. I'm fine, Margaret said, though her voice shook slightly on the words. I handled it. You should never have had to handle it. His hand cupped her jaw, gentle despite the fury radiating off him. This ends now. Not because I am angry, though I am. Because Greco has just proven he will use you to reach me, and I will not spend one more day allowing that to remain true. What happened over the following 3 days, Margaret only learned pieces of afterward, delivered to her carefully and without detail by a husband who clearly wanted to protect her from the specifics even as he refused to hide the outcome. Salvatore Greco's operation on the eastern docks collapsed within 72 hours. Dismantled through a combination of pressure Margaret did not fully understand and consequences she chose not to ask about too closely. Greco himself disappeared from the territory entirely, and though nobody in the family said the word that described what that disappearance actually meant, Margaret understood it well enough not to require the explanation spelled out. You didn't have to destroy his entire operation, she said to Marco, the night it was finally over, both of them sitting in the quiet of their bedroom with the kind of exhaustion that came after danger had passed rather than during it. I did, Marco said simply. Not because of the docks. Not even because of the message he tried to send me. Because a man who sends soldiers into a restaurant to threaten my wife in front of witnesses does not get to continue existing in my city as though nothing happened. That is not cruelty, Margaret. That is the only language men like Greco understand. And I have spent 17 years fluent in it. Margaret did not argue. She had spent a year now inside this family, long enough to understand that the safety Marco offered was never going to be gentle, that loving him meant accepting a world where danger and devotion occupied the same room, sometimes at the same hour. She had chosen it anyway, with open eyes, the same way she had chosen to stay through Concetta's cruelty, and through the fear in that parking lot, and through the 90 seconds of bluffing that might easily have gone the other way. What happens now? She asked. Now, Marco said, reaching for her hand with the same certainty he had shown the night he pulled her chair to the head of the table. We live. Greco is gone. My mother has finally understood the cost of testing me twice. And you, Margaret Ricci, have proven to every person in this family and every rival outside it that you were never someone to be managed, protected from decisions, or hidden in a kitchen away from the table where you belong. I never wanted to prove anything, Margaret said quietly. I just wanted to eat dinner with my husband. I know. His grip on her hand tightened, warm and certain in a way that made the whole dangerous, complicated shape of this life feel, for the first time since she had married into it, like something worth every cost it had demanded. That is exactly why I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to ask for that again. Concetta did not attend dinner again for several weeks, choosing instead to take her meals privately, A silence Margaret recognized not as peace but as recalculation, the particular quiet of a woman deciding whether the family she had spent a lifetime shaping was still hers to shape at all. When she finally returned to the table, 3 weeks later, she did not apologize, not directly, not in words that Margaret could have repeated to anyone. She simply pulled out the chair across from Margaret's, the one beside Marco, and sat down without comment, passing the bread basket in Margaret's direction before anyone had to ask. It was not forgiveness. Margaret understood that clearly, watching the careful, wordless gesture for what it was. A woman testing whether there was still room for her in a family she had nearly lost through her own cruelty. But it was a beginning, small and unspoken, and Margaret found she did not need more than that tonight. She had her husband beside her, his hand resting warm against her knee beneath the table where only she could feel it, and a plate in front of her at the head of a table where nobody, not tonight, not ever again, would tell her she did not belong. She picked up her fork, and across the table, Marco caught her eye and held it, the way he had learned to hold it since the night he found her crying softly over an enamel plate against a kitchen wall, and Margaret understood, finally, fully, that whatever this family cost her, whatever danger still waited somewhere in the shadow of a life built on debts and territory and blood, she had chosen the one man in it who would never again let her eat alone.